Love in the Canyon Winds by Oliver Hale. The stagecoach lurched violently as it hit another rut in the dusty road, and Catherine Morrison gripped the worn leather seat to keep from tumbling into the lap of the elderly gentleman across from her. Through the small window, she could see nothing but endless stretches of red rock and scrub brush, a far cry from the manicured gardens and cobblestone streets of Boston she had left behind 3 weeks ago. "The first time to Arizona territory, miss?" asked her fellow passenger, a kind-faced man with silver whiskers who had introduced himself as Dr. Samuel Hayes when they departed from the last way station. "Yes, indeed," Catherine replied, smoothing her traveling dress with hands that trembled slightly, though whether from the rough ride or her nerves, she couldn't say. "I'm to be the new schoolteacher in Red Rock." Dr. Hayes nodded approvingly. "Fine town, Red Rock. Growing fast with the copper mine opening up. You'll find the people welcoming, though they can be particular about newcomers." Catherine had heard as much in the letters from the town council. They needed someone to educate their children, someone with proper credentials and moral character. What they didn't know was that she needed them just as desperately, needed a place far enough from Boston where certain memories couldn't follow her, where she could start fresh without the weight of her past mistakes haunting every interaction. The stagecoach began to slow, and Catherine peered out to see a collection of adobe buildings nestled in a valley between towering red cliffs. Red Rock looked smaller than she'd imagined, but clean and purposeful, with wide streets and neat gardens despite the harsh landscape. "Miss Morrison," the driver called down from his perch, "this here's your stop." Catherine gathered her carpet bag and the small trunk containing her most precious possessions, her books, her teaching materials, and the few letters she'd kept from her mother before consumption claimed her 2 years prior. As she stepped down from the coach, the dry heat hit her like opening an oven door, and she immediately understood why the women she glimpsed wore wide-brimmed hats and long sleeves despite the temperature. "You must be our new teacher." The voice was warm and feminine, and Catherine turned to see a woman about her own age approaching with a welcoming smile. She was perhaps 30, with glossy dark hair pinned back practically and kind brown eyes that squinted at the corners. "I'm Margaret Caldwell. My husband runs the general store and I help organize the school board. We're so pleased you've come." "Thank you, Mrs. Caldwell. I'm Catherine Morrison." They shook hands, and Catherine was grateful for the woman's firm, friendly grip. "Please call me Margaret. We don't stand much on ceremony here. Now, let me show you to your lodgings. You'll be staying in the rooms above Mrs. Patterson's boarding house. She's prepared a lovely space for you." As they walked down the dusty main street, Margaret pointed out the various establishments, the bank, the saloon, which she mentioned with slight disapproval, the church, and her husband's store. The town was indeed small, but Catherine could see signs of prosperity in the well-maintained buildings and the steady flow of people going about their business. "The schoolhouse is just there," Margaret said, indicating a neat wooden building painted white with green shutters. "We built it just last year when it became clear we had enough children to warrant a proper teacher. Before that, I was doing my best with lessons in the church, but with my own 3 little ones and another on the way." She patted her stomach with a rueful smile. Catherine felt a flutter of both excitement and nervousness as she gazed at the building that would become her domain. "How many students will I have?" 18, ranging from 6 to 14 years old. Most are children of the miners and shop owners, though we also have several from the ranching families in the area. You'll find them eager to learn for the most part, though a few of the older boys can be challenging. They had reached the boarding house, a 2-story adobe structure with a covered porch adorned with climbing roses that seemed impossibly lush in the desert climate. Mrs. Patterson proved to be a widow in her 50s with steel-gray hair and a brisk, efficient manner that immediately put Catherine at ease. "Your rooms are upstairs, dear?" she said, leading Catherine up a narrow staircase. 2 rooms, a sitting room and bedroom, with a lovely view of the mountains. Meals are served downstairs with the other boarders at 6, 12, and 6. No gentlemen callers after 9 o'clock, and no spirits in the rooms. The accommodations were simple but clean, with whitewashed walls, a comfortable bed covered in a colorful quilt, and indeed a spectacular view of the red cliffs that surrounded the town. Catherine set down her bag and felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. This could be home. "There's a welcoming supper tomorrow evening at the Caldwells," Margaret said. "You'll meet some of the other families, and have a chance to see the children before school begins on Monday. I hope that's not too soon?" "Not at all. I'm eager to begin." And she was, Catherine realized. For the first time in months she felt a spark of genuine anticipation rather than the hollow determination that had carried her west. The next evening, Catherine dressed carefully in her best blue dress. Not too fine to seem presumptuous, but nice enough to make a good impression. She had spent the day exploring the town and reviewing the curriculum materials the previous teacher had left behind. Red Rock was growing on her already, with its friendly atmosphere and spectacular natural beauty. The Caldwell home was a charming adobe house with a garden that defied the desert climate through obvious care and ingenuity. Margaret greeted her warmly and introduced her to a steady stream of families: the Hendersons, who ran the hotel; the Murphys, whose husband worked in the copper mine; the Weatherbys, who owned the largest ranch in the area. "And this," said Margaret, drawing Catherine toward a tall man who had just entered with his hat in his hands, "is James Hartwell. James owns the ranch just north of town, and his daughter Annie will be one of your students." Catherine looked up, and up, into the bluest eyes she had ever seen. James Hartwell was perhaps 35, with sun-darkened skin and brown hair that looked as though he spent more time worrying about his cattle than his appearance. He had the weathered, capable look of a man who worked with his hands, but there was something in his expression that spoke of education and refinement. "Miss Morrison." His voice was low and pleasant, with just a hint of an accent she couldn't place. "Welcome to Red Rock. I hope you'll find us civilized enough for your liking." There was something almost challenging in his tone, and Catherine felt her spine straighten. "I'm sure I will, Mr. Hartwell. I found the people here to be quite hospitable." "James has been skeptical about hiring a teacher from back east," Margaret said with an apologetic smile. "He thinks we should have found someone more familiar with local conditions." "I see." Catherine met his gaze directly. "And what conditions might those be, Mr. Hartwell?" "Well," he said, his expression suggesting he was warming to his subject, "the children here aren't used to fancy manners and formal lessons. They need practical education, reading, writing, and arithmetic, yes, but also how to survive in country that doesn't forgive mistakes. They need to understand the land they live on, not just memorize poetry and practice penmanship." Catherine felt her temper rise, though she kept her voice level. "I assure you, Mr. Hartwell, that I'm perfectly capable of providing a well-rounded education. I may be from Boston, but I'm not some helpless hothouse flower who faints at the sight of hard work." "I didn't say you were." "You implied it." They stared at each other for a moment, and Catherine was aware that the conversation around them had quieted. Then James Hartwell smiled, a slow, genuine smile that transformed his entire face and made Catherine's stomach flutter in a most unexpected way. "I did imply it," he admitted, "and I apologize. Perhaps I've become too quick to judge. This territory has a way of doing that to a person." "Apology accepted," Catherine said, though she remained wary. "I hope you'll give me a chance to prove that I can be exactly what these children need." "I hope so too, Miss Morrison, for their sake." The rest of the evening passed pleasantly, though Catherine found herself stealing glances at James Hartwell as he talked with other guests. She learned that he had come to Arizona Territory 5 years ago, after his wife died in childbirth, bringing his young daughter to start fresh in the harsh but honest country. He was well respected in the community, known for his fair dealing and his willingness to help neighbors in times of trouble. Monday morning arrived bright and clear, and Catherine stood before the schoolhouse at 7:30, her heart beating fast with anticipation and nerves. She had spent the weekend preparing lessons and arranging the classroom, determined to make the best possible impression. The children began arriving shortly before 8, ranging from tiny 6-year-olds clinging to their mother's skirts to gangly adolescents who looked as though they'd rather be anywhere else. Catherine greeted each one warmly, learning names and trying to put them at ease. Annie Hartwell was among the last to arrive, and Catherine recognized her father's blue eyes immediately. The girl was perhaps 10 years old, with long brown braids and a serious expression that seemed older than her years. "Good morning, Annie," Catherine said gently. "I'm Miss Morrison. I'm very pleased to meet you." "Good morning, Miss Morrison." The child's response was polite but reserved. "Papa said I should tell you that I can already read quite well and do sums, so you needn't spend extra time on me." Catherine smiled. "That's wonderful. Perhaps you can help me with some of the younger children who are still learning their letters." Annie's face brightened immediately. "I like that very much." The morning went better than Catherine had dared hope. The children were indeed eager to learn, and even the older boys whom Margaret had warned her about seemed engaged by her lessons. She had prepared carefully, incorporating practical examples that related to their daily lives while still maintaining academic rigor. During the lunch break, as the children played outside, Annie Hartwell approached her desk with a book in her hands. "Miss Morrison, I brought this to show you. Papa reads it to me sometimes, but I can read most of it myself now." Catherine looked at the volume with surprise. It was a collection of Shakespeare's sonnets, hardly what she would have expected to find in a ranch house library. "This is beautiful, Annie. Do you have a favorite?" "I like the one about the summer's day," Annie said shyly, "though I don't understand all the words. Perhaps we could read it together sometime, and I could help explain the parts that are unclear." Annie's face lit up. "Oh, would you? Papa tries, but he says poetry isn't his strong suit, even though he reads it well." Catherine found herself curious about James Hartwell's background. A rancher who owned Shakespeare and read poetry to his daughter was not what she had expected after their conversation at the welcoming party. The afternoon lessons went smoothly as well, and Catherine felt genuine satisfaction as she dismissed her students for the day. This was why she had become a teacher, the joy of seeing young minds engaged and growing. She was tidying her desk when she heard boots on the wooden steps outside. James Hartwell appeared in the doorway, hat in hand once again. "Mr. Hartwell, has Annie forgotten something?" "No, she's waiting outside with the wagon. I wanted to speak with you about her education." Catherine straightened, preparing for another challenge to her methods or credentials. "Of course. Please, come in." He entered the classroom, seeming to fill the space with his presence. "I owe you another apology, Miss Morrison. Annie hasn't stopped talking about school since I picked her up. She's excited about learning in a way I haven't seen since—" He paused, and Catherine caught a flicker of old pain in his expression. "Since her mother died. Marie used to teach her, you see. She was educated in New Orleans before we married." "I'm glad Annie is happy," Catherine said carefully. "She's a bright child, and a pleasure to teach." "She is that." James moved closer to her desk, and Catherine caught the scent of leather and something indefinably masculine. "I was wondering, she mentioned that you might help her with poetry. Marie used to read to her, and I've tried to continue, but I'm afraid I don't have the background to really help her understand the finer points." "I'd be happy to work with her," Catherine said. "Perhaps she could stay after school 1 or 2 afternoons a week?" That would mean a great deal to both of us." His smile was warm and grateful, and Catherine felt that flutter in her stomach again. "And Miss Morrison, thank you for being patient with my skepticism. I can see that Annie is in good hands." As he turned to leave, Catherine found herself speaking without thinking. "Mr. Hartwell, Annie mentioned that you read poetry even though it's not your strong suit. I couldn't help but notice she had Shakespeare with her today." He paused in the doorway. "Marie's books. She was quite well educated, much better than a rancher's wife probably needed to be. But she loved literature, and she wanted Annie to love it too." His voice softened. "I do my best to honor that, even if I stumble over the meter sometimes. I think," Catherine said quietly, "that Annie is very lucky to have a father who tries so hard to nurture what her mother valued." Their eyes met across the classroom, and Catherine felt something shift between them. A recognition, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding. Then James nodded once and was gone, leaving Catherine alone with the lingering scent of leather and the unexpected warmth in her chest. Over the following weeks, Catherine settled into the rhythms of life in Red Rock. Her students grew more comfortable with her, and she with them. Annie Hartwell became one of her particular pleasures. The girl was not only bright but hungry for knowledge in a way that reminded Catherine of herself at that age. True to his word, James began leaving Annie after school twice a week for extra tutoring in literature. Catherine found herself looking forward to these sessions, not only because of Annie's enthusiasm but because James would often arrive early to collect his daughter, giving them opportunities to talk. She learned that he had been a lawyer in St. Louis before his wife's death, that he had chosen ranching as much for its solitude as for any love of cattle, and that he read voraciously in the evenings after Annie went to bed. He, in turn, drew out stories of her childhood in Boston, her years at the female seminary, and carefully, gradually, the circumstances that had brought her west. "I was engaged," she told him one evening, as they sat on the schoolhouse steps, while Annie played with some of the other children whose parents were late collecting them, "to a very suitable gentleman from a very respectable family." "Was?" James asked gently. Catherine looked out at the red cliffs surrounding the town, their color deepening in the early evening light. 3 months before the wedding, I discovered that my very suitable, very respectable fiancé had been conducting an affair with his business partner's wife for over a year. When I confronted him, he suggested that we could still marry as planned, that I should simply learn to be more accommodating of his needs. Good God. James's voice was harsh with disgust. "What did you do?" "I broke the engagement, of course. But Boston society, well, let's just say that a woman who breaks an engagement so close to the wedding is presumed to be at fault, regardless of the circumstances." The gossip became unbearable. My teaching position at the Young Ladies' Academy became untenable. So I decided to start fresh somewhere that didn't know my history. James was quiet for a long moment. "His loss," he said finally, "and our gain." Catherine looked at him in surprise, and found him studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I mean," he said, his voice slightly rough, "Red Rock's gain. The children are lucky to have you." "Yes," Catherine said softly, "of course." But she couldn't shake the feeling that he had meant something else entirely. As autumn deepened into winter, Catherine found herself drawn more and more into life of the community. She helped organize a harvest festival, assisted Margaret Caldwell with preparations for the church Christmas pageant, and even taught some of the adult women to read in the evenings. Through it all, she was increasingly aware of James Hartwell's presence in her life. Their conversations had grown longer and more personal, and she had begun to look forward to his visits with an anticipation that had nothing to do with her fondness for Annie. The moment of truth came on a cold December evening, when a sudden snowstorm trapped them both at the schoolhouse after one of Annie's tutoring sessions. The snow had begun falling heavily just as Catherine was dismissing Annie for the day, and by the time James arrived to collect his daughter, the roads were already treacherous. "We'll have to wait it out," James said, looking out at the swirling white that obscured everything beyond a few feet from the windows. "It should pass by morning." Catherine nodded, trying to ignore the way her pulse quickened at the prospect of spending the night in James's company. "There's firewood, and I have some food in my desk. We'll be comfortable enough." Annie, delighted by the adventure, curled up in her father's coat by the fire and was soon fast asleep. Catherine and James sat across from each other at her desk, sharing bread and cheese by the light of the oil lamp. "Tell me about your wife," Catherine said impulsively, then immediately regretted the question. "I'm sorry, that was presumptuous." "No, it's all right." James was quiet for a moment, staring into the lamp flame. She was like a bright bird full of music and laughter. She could make the dreariest day seem beautiful just by being in it. When she died, he shook his head. "I thought the world had lost all its color." "And now?" He looked up at her, and Catherine saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "Now I'm beginning to remember what color looks like." The words hung in the air between them, full of unspoken possibility. Catherine felt her cheeks warm under his gaze. "James," she began, but he held up a hand. "I know I have no right to say this. I know you came here to start fresh, not to get tangled up with a widowed rancher who spends more time talking to cattle than to people. But Catherine," he reached across the desk and covered her hand with his. "These past months, watching you with Annie, talking with you, seeing how you've become part of this community, I can't pretend anymore that my interest is purely paternal." Catherine stared down at their joined hands. His was work-roughened and scarred, but gentle, and the touch sent warmth shooting up her arm. "I care for you too," she whispered, "more than I should perhaps." "Why more than you should?" She looked up to meet his eyes. "Because I swore I wouldn't let myself be vulnerable again. Because I came here to be independent, to make my own way. Because you're afraid." It wasn't a question, and Catherine found herself nodding. Terrified, she admitted. James lifted his free hand to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing across her skin with infinite tenderness. "So am I," he said quietly. "I never thought I could feel this way about anyone again. But Catherine, some risks are worth taking." When he kissed her, it was with a gentleness that spoke of patience and understanding, of a man who knew what it meant to lose everything and find the courage to love again. Catherine felt something inside her chest unfurl like a flower blooming, and she kissed him back with all the emotion she had been holding carefully in check for months. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing unsteadily. "What happens now?" Catherine asked. "Now," James said, "we take things one day at a time. We see where this leads us. And we don't let fear make our decisions for us." Catherine looked over at Annie, still sleeping peacefully by the fire, then back at James. "She comes first," she said firmly. "Whatever happens between us, Annie's well-being comes first." "Agreed," James said immediately. "Though I think you'll find that what's good for Annie and what's good for us might not be as different as you imagine." The snow stopped falling before dawn, and they made their way back to town as the sun painted the white landscape in shades of rose and gold. Catherine knew that tongues would wag about their night alone together, but she found she didn't care as much as she would have expected. Red Rock had become her home, and these people had become her friends. They would understand, or they would adjust. Spring brought changes to Red Rock and to Catherine's life. James began calling on her formally, and their courtship became the subject of much pleased speculation among the townspeople. Annie was delighted by the development, and Catherine found herself falling in love, not just with James but with the idea of becoming part of a family again. The proposal came on a warm May evening as they walked along the creek that ran behind the schoolhouse. Annie had run ahead, chasing fireflies in the gathering dusk, and James stopped suddenly, catching Catherine's hand. "Marry me?" he said simply. Catherine felt her heart stop, then begin beating double time. "James, I know it's soon. I know you value your independence. But Catherine, I can't imagine my life without you in it anymore. Annie can't either. We need you, not just as a teacher or a friend, but as part of our family. I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life showing you how much." Catherine looked at this man who had somehow slipped past all her carefully constructed defenses, who had shown her that love didn't have to mean loss of self, and felt the last of her fears dissolve. "Yes," she said, and watched his face transform with joy. "Yes, I'll marry you." When he kissed her this time, it was with all the promise of their future together, and Catherine knew that she had found not just love, but home. The wedding took place in late June, in the little church with all of Red Rock in attendance. Catherine wore her mother's pearl necklace and a dress of ivory silk that Margaret had helped her order from Denver. Annie served as flower girl, beaming with pride and happiness. As Catherine walked down the aisle toward James, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had come to Red Rock running from her past, seeking nothing more than a place to hide and heal. Instead, she had found a community, a purpose, and a love deeper and truer than anything she had ever imagined. When James took her hands and spoke his vows, promising to love and cherish her for all the days of their lives, Catherine felt the final pieces of her heart click into place. She was no longer the broken woman who had fled Boston in shame and fear. She was Catherine Hartwell now, teacher and wife and mother, surrounded by love and belonging. As they kissed to seal their union, with Annie cheering and the congregation applauding, Catherine knew that she had found her place in the world at last. The red rocks of Arizona had given her shelter, but love had given her wings, and she was ready to soar. The end.